Hello, my name is Brendan Hughes. I have been working at the European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction for 20 years, looking at drug laws around Europe and more around the world eventually. So now I'm going to give you different views, different knowledge about cannabis legislation around Europe. To start with, we'll look at the penalties, which is the usual way that we discuss cannabis laws around Europe. And that will be the penalties for use-related effects, use-related offences, and supply-related offences. We'll also look at the recent discussion about legalization, regulation, permitting cannabis for recreational use. We'll see also for other uses. So those are usually the discussions about cannabis laws amongst narcotic drug specialists. But these days we have to step back a bit and look at exactly what is cannabis legally, because there have been changes. There have been discussions about what it is and what it isn't in international laws. And this includes cannabis as fiber or as seeds, which we know about hemp. And these have effects on various different European laws, governing medicines, governing food, governing cosmetics, and even smoking products. And then finally, we'll just quickly look about what this means for cannabinoids other than tetrahydrocannabinol, because cannabis plant produces well over 100 different cannabinoids. Most of the time, as drugs experts, we're looking at THC, but now there are broader questions being asked and more products coming on the market. So to start with, let's be clear about some legal terms that we often use when we talk about drug control. And one of them is decriminalization, which I would summarize as reducing the size or the significance of the penalty, whether it's reducing or removing the number of years in prison, or whether it's about a criminal record or where you got tried, etc. Then we have a system of depenalization, which is not so much the size of the penalty, but it's removing the application of the penalty. So there are some countries such as Germany, Austria, Poland, where they say if the offense is considered minor, and they have various ways to describe minor, then no penalty shall be applied. The case will be closed. There is also the issue of diversion. Diversion we describe as moving from a punitive response to a rehabilitative response. And there has been quite some confusion over years, because one of the most famous models of decriminalization is the Portuguese model. But this should not be famous for its decriminalization, which is not so new. It should be famous for its diversion techniques, because the main thing about the Portuguese model is moving to a system primarily governed by the Ministry of Health, not the Ministry of Justice or Interior. And then finally, the concept of legalization of cannabis, usually regulation, because there are strict rules around it. And we define that as permitting some form of supply. That's not necessarily shops, as we'll see, but that can also be growing your own plants in your own house and using them. And if you want to see more, we have this short video on YouTube very simple explanations, and we have an edition in Spanish as well. So a very fast picture of what it looks like around Europe. If we consider two use-related offences, we're going to consider consumption itself, drug use, drug consumption, and possession for personal use. They seem very similar, but in fact, international laws don't request any offence of consumption or any penalty for it. They do request a penalty for personal possession. The logic being that once you have consumed something, you're not likely to give it to somebody else. When you have something for personal possession, you might change your mind at the last minute and choose to give it to someone else. So the modern international laws are much more concerned with reducing supply. That's why you have an international law. You don't have an international law to govern use. So for drug consumption, as I mentioned, it's not requested under international law. So here you see a picture of those countries which look at the offence of consumption of cannabis itself. Most of them, the yellow ones in the middle of Europe there, they have no offence at all of drug consumption. Those coloured light blue have an offence of drug consumption, but there is no kind of incarceration possible for it under those laws. And those in dark blue have an offence of drug consumption, and there is some kind of incarceration. In one or two countries, those are penalties of what they call administrative arrest, which can be 2 weeks, 1 month locked up. It's their style of punishment. And in other countries, there's imprisonment linked to the offence of consumption itself. By contrast, if we look at the offence of personal possession, we can see clearly that everybody has this as an offence. Once again, about 1/3 of the countries in Europe don't have any incarceration possible for this offence for cannabis, and about 2/3 do have incarceration possible. Again, the vast majority of them, we're talking about prison sentences. This is always talking about the maximum penalty available in the law. It's not talking about what actually happens. It's not talking about the minimum penalties. These are the maximum penalties available to whoever is judging some kind of minor offence. And there are many different ways that the different countries describe minor offences. The usual question then is how much these penalties affect drug use. Do they work? Are they effective? And in that way, people want to know if changing the penalty would somehow increase or decrease cannabis use. So some years ago, we looked at our data at EMCDA, where we track countries' use of cannabis amongst different age groups. And we are also aware of when some of them changed the penalties in their laws. And we plotted these on a graph to try to understand if there was a common trend about the penalty increasing or decreasing. Could we actually see, could we predict what was likely to happen? So here is the first half of a graph that we drew up, where we took all of the countries where we knew there was a change in the law for cannabis possession or use, and we had the trend graphs of these groups of young adults, 15 to 34, who had used cannabis in the last 12 months. We could also look at who used cannabis in the last month, but that sounds more like regular users, and it seems less likely that they would be affected by a change in law. And we plotted the rate of drug use, the prevalence, over time. We lined the countries up according to their year of change that you see in the middle, to give us a clear graphic to show if there was any common outcome of increasing or decreasing. They changed in many different years, but we lined them up to make this graphic more instructive. And so we separated out the countries where the penalty decreased and the penalty increased. So decreased, you can see the trend lines in blue. Penalty increased, you can see the trend lines in red. Normally, we hear so much discussion from many different policymakers all around Europe, if not the world. They expect when the penalty is decreased that the use goes up. So you would expect the blue lines to go up after the year of change. And when the penalties are increased, there is a belief or a hope that the use will go down after the change. However, as you can see, it's not as simple as that. There could be several reasons for this. I would suspect that some of the bigger reasons are that the users themselves don't actually know what the penalty was or is. When I've seen some examples of this change being discussed more recently in the media, they get it wrong. They talk about legalization, if the penalty is going down, etc. Or the fact that the penalty increases, nobody tells any users, so they just don't know, they're not aware of it. One of the other common things may be the practice of those people involved. Do the police stop more people or the same amount? Do the prosecutors prosecute more people or the same amount? Do the judges give a higher penalty or do they give the same amount? Because if they stay to the previous habits, then it's less likely to affect the users at a population level. So we have no clear impact of simply changing the penalty in law. I emphasize here that this is increasing or reducing the penalty. This is not removing the penalty and making something legal. So that's briefly a picture of drug laws on cannabis use around Europe. Now let's quickly look at cannabis supply. And here is a graphic up the left axis. You can see the number of years in prison, not labeled, I'm sorry to say, not sure why. The number of years in prison that somebody can expect for supply of 1 kilo of cannabis. And then the vertical lines represent the range in each country according to the law of the number of years in prison that could be given. This was a study you can see to the right, a study of drug trafficking penalties, survey of expert opinion. And there you can see the details about the 1 kilo of cannabis, its purity rate, and also what kind of offender. It was not a realistic study because we asked for an offender who has no criminal record, no connections to organized crime. And in the same study, they were asked about 1 kilo of heroin. These people don't exist, but we had to do this for consistency purposes. So here already you see a big range in the laws across Europe of what kind of penalty somebody would receive for supply of 1 kilo of cannabis. Then we asked a group of experts, judges, prosecutors, defense lawyers in each country, what sentence they would really expect this offender to receive. And then you can see the ranges here were not always in line with the range of the penalty given in the law. It's also interesting, for example, to see that in some countries such as Luxembourg, Belgium, Croatia, Denmark, the group of experts was very regular. They all agreed quite consistently on the size of the penalty. And yet in other countries to the right, you can see Romania and Latvia was a very, very wide range of expectations of the penalty given. So these were the range, but I'll show you now in the red lines, the median points for you to understand that some of these ranges were quite disparate. So the red lines to the right of the graph, the horizontal red lines, show you the expected median sentence. Sometimes at the top, sometimes at the bottom, sometimes in the middle of the range. And this is how the graph is arranged. Why are there no median sentence to the countries on the left of the graph? And the answer there is because not all the experts agreed, I think it was less than 80%, agreed that the person would actually get an effective prison sentence. So an expert or some of the experts believed that the person would receive a suspended prison sentence. And we cannot find a median between effective and suspended prison sentences. So there you see about 10 or 11 countries not even guaranteeing that this particular offender would step inside a prison. They might possibly receive a suspended sentence. This may seem strange, but if you remember that this person had no previous criminal record, it was considered sometimes that this means that they would not get such a strict prison sentence as might be expected. And the green lines, we asked about the times of early release, if people were let out early for good behavior, and there again, we plotted them. So here is your variation of the likely or the expected sentencing practices for a theoretical example of someone supplying a kilogram of cannabis around Europe. It's tempting to say that this shows countries' different attitudes towards drug trafficking, but I believe there is reason to say this shows countries' different attitudes towards the value of short or long prison sentences. I don't think we can really project that it's the values they give to drug trafficking offences. So people have different policies. We have seen that they've changed those legislation, those policies. And while there are many changes, it should be remembered that there are different reasons to change. So just because you hear so many countries have decriminalized around Europe, they don't always decriminalize for the same reasons. They may reduce penalties, for example, to encourage drug users to get into treatment. They may have little interest in drug users, but they want to save law enforcement resources. The police are taking up too much time with these cannabis users. And even we had some countries who just completely changed their criminal code. It was overall something to do with removing small sentences or similar, and therefore drug offences were grouped within those. So many different reasons to change. Just because somebody decriminalizes doesn't mean it's because they want to change the offence of cannabis use. But also remember that there are reasons to increase penalties. And whilst several of them are often to send a message that the society disapproves of drug use, there were also a couple where penalties are increased to give law enforcement more powers. So this is a certain legislative technique. It does not mean that just because the penalty was raised from 1 year to 2 years in prison, it does not mean that offenders will now start to get 2 years in prison, but it's because the police have more powers, or the prosecutors have more powers once an offence is punishable by up to 2 years in prison. I think in Austria, for example, they had the ability to detain suspects for longer than 24 hours as a result of that change of law. Whilst we're talking about changing cannabis policies, let's also jump to legalization, regulation, and look at what's the objectives for regulation of cannabis. And so here you see some of the most common objectives that we have tracked either across the Americas, the different US states, Canada, Uruguay, but also we are hearing them now increasingly in Europe. Of course, many reasons why not to regulate cannabis. And there you see some of the concerns, whether it's the increase of use or other drugs or supply, road crashes, or productivity, etc. So once again, you will hear of a change, but you should be aware of why the change is made. And this is important because once people start to evaluate a law, when they all ask, does it work? And they want to look 1 or 2 or 3 years or 5 years later, they say, did it work? The big question is, what was it supposed to do in the first place? Because if the point of changing the law was to raise tax revenue, then your answer should include raising tax revenue. How much was raised? If your law was changed in order to concentrate on serious crime, as several of the US states was, then the evaluation question should be, how much were you able to concentrate more on serious crime? And this is actually a question which is often then forgotten because, like some things, it's very difficult to measure. But it's very important that the evaluation depends on the original objective. So continuing with this idea of regulating cannabis, or even actually a general policy model, what would be the spectrum? There's a whole spectrum of possibilities. So we've seen criminal penalties, which may or may not include this diversion, this referral to treatment, and they may or they may not include incarceration. We've seen non-criminal penalties, even if there's not even a penalty, then at minimum confiscation of the substance. I think once the substance is not confiscated, that starts to become a form of permitting supply. Again, these may or may not have some kind of referral to a rehabilitative solution. On the permissive side, we start to see these models of allowing somebody to grow it and use it at home, but they can't supply other people, they can't sell in particular. There may be the idea of closed clubs, run not for profit. I think most people here are fully aware of the issues in some regions of Spain, where there's very much a disparity of beliefs between what is and what isn't permitted, and who has the power to decide this and who does not. We've also seen how these, again, they may look good on paper, but they can be quite abusive in practice. And there can be the models of sales outlets, and these might be state outlets for cannabis sale or commercial outlets for sale. I put dollar signs there because if you remember this question about tax revenue, then chances are if you want to raise tax revenue, you're going to need sales outlets. Non-profit closed clubs or home grow will not be suitable for that purpose. Those are very broadly some categories, and be aware that, of course, countries can make changes between the categories or even within the categories. Even criminal penalties with incarceration. I've seen big discussions between countries who say, for example, the United Kingdom, where I come from, there was a discussion about moving from a maximum of 5 years in prison to a maximum of 2 years in prison. Still criminal, still imprisonment, but still a big argument about whether that change should be made. So just if it helps you in terms of icons, this idea of home grow, social clubs, state shops, or private shops are probably the 4 models that one would think about when legalizing cannabis. So what do we see in Europe? In Europe, we now start to see some changes being proposed along these lines. So the Netherlands, which has had coffee shops running for since the mid-1970s or the mid-80s, for decades, they've had a problem with supplying coffee shops. That was never regulated anyway, and it was strictly forbidden. So now they are starting an experiment of what they call a closed supply chain, where they have specifically chosen growers, producers, and shops to receive these authorized cannabis products. And they're running that experiment in 10 municipalities. And to give you an idea, the Netherlands has something like 350 municipalities. So they're running an experiment in 10. And they will be taking many measurements to see what are the effects. So in those municipalities, the supply chain has to supply all coffee shops in those municipalities. They will not be mixing, as it were, licit and illicit supply. In Luxembourg, for the last few years, at the last election, there was a promise to permit sales to residents. In fact, we've heard in the last few days that this plan is not going forward at the moment. They won't be permitting sales, but they should be permitting home growing from seeds. So I don't think anybody will be selling small cannabis plants, but they'll be selling seeds with THC, and they intend to permit home growing maximum of 4 plants. Similarly, Malta have put forward a draft law that would permit home growing, and this time as well, non-profit social clubs. For those who consider that they don't know how to grow or that they don't grow very well, people will have the option to join clubs and buy their cannabis from growers there. But again, strictly not at a profit, and they can only be a member of one club. They can't join many, and the supply is limited. And Switzerland, which is not in the European Union, but is geographically in the center of the European Union, there is a proposal to allow different cities to experiment with forms of regulated supply. I believe there's a maximum of 5,000 consumers per city. I think they already have to be regular cannabis users. And we will then see the different city proposals and whether they expect to sell through dedicated shops or pharmacies or somewhere else, and what they sell and how they sell it. These changes are coming. We still look to see the details. Both Luxembourg and Malta have not passed their laws yet, so there may still be changes in the negotiations of the laws. What is cannabis legally? I think we need to step back a bit from this thing where we all think we know what we're talking about, because in fact, in recent years, it's shown that there can be more and more confusion, particularly coming from a law, an international law that was drafted in 1961. So I put the extracts here for you in Spanish, which I think will help most of your readers. So here you have the definition of cannabis in the 1961 convention, the flowering, fruiting tops of cannabis. So not the seeds. We're talking about the whole plant, and we're talking about cannabis resin as well. Within that, however, we know that there has been an industry of hemp fiber for, frankly, hundreds of years. We paint on canvas. The word canvas is an old French form of cannabis. Sails were made from canvas, hemp ropes at the time that our nations went out around the oceans were all made from the cannabis plant. And this is not talking about drugs, this is talking about fiber. So in 1961, they already recognized that the convention did not apply to cannabis plants recognized, intended for industrial purposes, for the fiber and for the seeds, which are nutritional. And just to let you know that in the European Union, this means that the plant will produce no more than 0.2% tetrahydrocannabinol. And here is just a short extract of the detailed regulation which says how you test exactly for that 0.2% of THC. And if you see there, it's the top part of the plant, something like the top 30 centimeters of the plant, not the whole plant, just the top part, which is where the THC is always stronger. And so there is the operational definition inside Europe about the distinction between hemp and psychoactive cannabis plants. And when you see this distinction, it's really important to remember that this 0.2% THC is a limit set for cultivation. It is not a limit set for food products. You'll see things like this, which says you can buy these CBD products and they're okay because there's less than 0.2% THC. But as you understood from the previous slide, that is actually irrelevant. But it's been a very common advertising theme in the last few years where people are trying to sell different cannabis products. If you have a chocolate bar, which is 0.2% THC, you will get very, very high eating that chocolate bar. So let's look at how cannabis is classified in the UN Convention, because this is important. So very simply, there are 4 lists. List 1, all forms of control. And inside that list, we have cannabis, cannabis resin, and extracts and tinctures of cannabis. Then there is a slightly less controlled list. Meanwhile, there's a third one for preparations involving some of those drugs in list 1 or 2, which are not so strong. And then finally, there is also list 4, which is an extra level of caution for those substances particularly liable to abuse, for where there's very little compensatory therapeutic properties. And cannabis and cannabis resin were listed in that last list as well. But there has been a change last year, so I should explain this. Very simply, the World Health Organization has an expert committee on drug dependence who are allowed to make proposals to add new drugs, to move drugs, or delete them. And so there was a critical review of cannabis and cannabis products in 2018, where the committee realized that this expression, extracts and tinctures of cannabis, covered everything. It covered those products with psychoactive properties, and it covered products which had no psychoactive properties. They found it very broad. You have to remember that in 1961, it was not clear that the cannabinoid tetrahydrocannabinol was the psychoactive ingredient. So they just said any kind of extracts and tinctures of cannabis. But you'll see now that this is starting to cause us problems. And so because of this, because of the critical review and the various expressions and phrases involved, there were 6 recommendations to change cannabis-related entries. They were finally voted at the Commission for Narcotic Drugs in December 2020. 55 countries voted, and they accepted one of the 6 recommendations, which was to remove cannabis and cannabis resin from Schedule 4, which was the schedule referring to particularly dangerous and not offset by medical use. The other proposals, which included removal of the expression extracts and tinctures of cannabis, they were rejected. And so it stays. We still have list one, cannabis, resin, and extracts and tinctures, but what we don't have anymore is this idea that cannabis and cannabis resin are in the particularly dangerous list of drugs with no appreciable medical use. We know now that they are not as dangerous as the other drugs in there, which mainly have the risk of poisoning, overdose poisoning, fatal overdose poisoning. And we do know that there are some sort of medical properties for cannabis and cannabis resin, although, of course, we know they're better if they're purified and extracted first. So this is the situation in international law. And now I'll show you how this can affect European laws and our own understanding of what is cannabis. So different European Union laws, medicines laws. The definition of a medicine in European Union law is those substances presented as if they have the ability to treat or prevent illnesses in human beings, or those substances which could be used to prevent or treat illness by provoking some kind of modification of physiological functions due to pharmacological action. So it's either by presentation or it's by their own properties, what they can actually do. And so what we see now in terms of cannabis is a typology of medicines approved, in fact, for fully authorized for medicinal use. So these are authorized medicinal products in various countries, all or some countries of Europe. So we have nabilone, a synthetic THC. We have dronabinol, which is a THC. In fact, it's usually produced synthetically. We have Sativex, which is a mix of CBD and THC. And we have Epidiolex, which is absolutely pure CBD. Those are the authorized medicinal products often coming from the cannabis plant or involving THC or CBD. Besides that, we have preparations of cannabis, which we would divide very briefly into crude cannabis material coming straight from the plant. We would consider magistral formulas, quite often dispensed through specialist pharmacies, measured out to specific prescriptions by doctors. And also we have quite serious preparations of cannabis products being produced very often by Canadian producers with their experience of legal cannabis, but also by European producers, increasingly, such as those in the Netherlands, in Italy, and some other countries. These last are really not to be confused with the first. They are presented very much as medicinal products. I'm sorry, those are the medicinal products. But nevertheless, they are very, very carefully produced to try to get very regular dosing. I just wanted to show you these as well, because we mentioned these authorized medicinal products, specifically licensed as medicines in different countries, but still, in terms of policy, I have seen countries listing these on their national list of medicines, and we see the media shouting that cannabis has been legalized in this country. So once again, this policy confusion, what is cannabis? what are we talking about? What is legalization? What are we talking about? And to understand how these different products vary and how they might be reported, how they're actually governed. I mentioned the cannabis preparations, which are carefully being made, even if they don't have formal marketing authorization as a medicine. We've done a review of these. Briefly, you can split them into early access medicines, which are usually given by a very specialized prescriber individually to named patients with certain kinds of conditions. Czech Republic and Croatia are a couple of examples there. And then you have like an expanded access scheme where you don't have to have every single patient being named and authorized. There are national regulations for how to use the medicines produced in the country or even imported from other countries. And there you see the Dutch, the Italians, the Germans, for example. There's probably still a lot of concern about this idea of medicinal uses of cannabis coming from our knowledge of North America, particularly the US, where there are so many stories about if you have a backache, you walk into a cannabis shop and say, I need a medicine, and a doctor writes you a prescription and you get a joint to smoke. I looked at this a little bit, and it's of course very, very difficult to compare. So this is a really crude comparison. The numbers might have changed since I did this the last time, but I think it still gives you a valid picture. So I took the Netherlands as the European example because their program has been running nearly as long as those in Colorado, California, Canada. You take the population, you try and understand how many medical cannabis users there are in the country, either registered or estimated numbers. And I think Colorado is interesting because you see this massive jump between pre-commercialization and post-commercialization. And then if you look at the rate of the users amongst the population, say by million population, you can see a couple of very similar numbers in the US states, a much smaller number in Canada, but the Netherlands doesn't come anywhere close. It is exponentially smaller than the rate of users in North America. And I think this is a really important point. Even though the figures are very, very crude, I think they still illustrate that the medicinal cannabis products, cannabis preparations being distributed around Europe have a much, much, much lower use rate, or should I say are much more tightly regulated than those in North America. Quickly having a look at food regulation. So European law defines a food as anything expected to be ingested by human beings, but it also said that food should not include those products defined as drugs by the 1961 UN Convention. And here, if you remember, we have the definition of drugs includes extracts and tinctures of cannabis. So right now, there is a challenge about how to regulate any food product that comes from cannabis. And there is this possibility of novel food, something not commonly consumed in Europe before 1997, and a novel food has to be individually authorized. Several companies are proposing products as novel food, usually involving CBD, cannabidiol, not THC. But they have to meet several safety requirements, just as all foods do around Europe. and we're not sure if or when any are going to be authorized. I think those people promoting them didn't realize just how many scientific results or studies they would have to submit to be authorized. Cosmetics is another question. So there is the definition of a cosmetic. It's usually just something to clean or to perfume the body, applied outside the body. But guess what? Once again, substances not permitted in cosmetics are those listed in lists 1 or 2 of the 1961 convention. Again, extracts and tinctures of cannabis. There has been a change there. And here is an example of how people are selling cannabis cosmetics. So this is a face mask. You can see from the font, from the name Seventh Heaven, and from the picture, you can see what these people are selling. But in fact, this comes from the oil from cannabis seeds. It is nothing to do with the leaf or the plant. Even the European Union has regulations on tobacco-related products, and these can include smokable herbal products which don't have tobacco, but still, if they're expected to be consumed by a process of combustion, they are covered by a European Union directive, which requires the manufacturers and the sellers to report the ingredients to the appropriate authorities. Now, we've been hearing a lot about CBD, cannabidiol, and I've been telling you about this idea of extract of cannabis. This has become quite big in the last few years, and finally a case went to the European Court of Justice, and there was a final judgment in 2020 where somebody had bought cannabis extract from the Czech Republic, where it was legal to make extract from the entire cannabis plant, and they were trying to sell it in vape cartridges in France, where legal cannabis extract can only come from, I think it's the fibers or seeds, but not the whole plant. And the sellers were convicted. They took their case to the European Court of Justice, saying, we're selling a product manufactured in the EU. And the interesting thing there was that the court stated for this particular CBD product, as far as we're concerned, this is not a drug in the sense of the single convention, the 1961 convention. So that has caused quite some thinking around different European corridors. With all of this idea that I've told you about extracts and tinctures of cannabis, finally the ECJ ruled that in this case it wasn't a drug, you couldn't include it amongst that grouping. But nevertheless, there are still interest, there are still concerns, there are still works happening about how to work this out around the different countries in a consistent and a regular fashion. Finally, what's next? So we always talk about THC. We've seen a lot of fuss in the last couple of years about CBD, but remember, if there's more than 100 cannabinoids available in the cannabis plant, then we will be seeing more. You can guarantee it. Cannabigerol, CBG, cannabidivarin, CBDV, there are many of these around. I think CBG has just been authorized as a cosmetic product for skincare, but there will be more and more of these coming onto the market as cannabis producers try and maximize their different sales lines and, of course, their product line. And we know that the agricultural industry, who are growing cannabis for fiber, are, of course, also interested in supplementing their income. We await to see the results of novel food authorizations for people selling CBD, whether it's CBD infused food or whether it's food supplements. I heard that most of them will be for food supplements because that way there's less requirement for safety authorizations for little children and for elderly people because they don't normally take that kind of food supplement. We know that countries are working on maximum safety limits for THC, CBD, etc. in food. And meanwhile, the agricultural industry is trying to push hemp to have not only 0.2%, but maybe 0.3%, even in some countries, 1% THC as a maximum. All these changes happening. And these, of course, also have implications for research, such as we do at the European Monitoring Centre. When we ask people, have you used cannabis in the last 12 months? We now fear the response, what do you mean by cannabis? All of this has implications. And so I can show you here just a couple of the reports that we have on the specific issues, such as medical use of cannabis and low THC cannabis products, sometimes the CBD cannabis products. We have these available on our website in several languages. I forget which ones exactly, but please have a look. And there will be a broader report coming out in the next few months, trying to cover all of the things that I've told you. Thank you very much for listening.